This story takes place when I was 17, female. I'm 20 now, so this was roughly 3 years ago. It was a late summer night, and I had just finished my shift working as a retail associate at my local Walmart. I know it's not the best job nowadays, but back then it was pretty decent for a first job as a 17-year-old. When I got to the bus stop, I get out my phone to track the bus and see that it was delayed by 2 hours. This obviously annoyed me, as I had to get home to go to sleep for school the next morning. There was no way in hell I was going to wait 2 hours for the bus, so I decided that I'd take another way home by walking. I didn't know it then, but this was actually a terrible decision, and you'll understand why later. My neighborhood is about a 20 to 30 minute walk, so I sucked it up and began the walk home. This area at the time of night was pretty quiet, not many cars on the streets. As I'm heading up the street listening to my music and whatnot, I hear an engine not too far behind me. At first I thought it was just my music playing, but after taking my earbuds out, that simply wasn't the case. About maybe 20 or so feet away was a pair of headlights approaching. Not really thinking anything of it, I tend back to my music when the car eventually pulls up beside me. Now, being a girl planning on majoring in mechanics, I was able to identify both the year and model of the car. It was a 2004 Honda Accord, and inside was a man that I had never seen before waving at me. I turned to him and gave him a friendly wave back just to be polite. I then see him motion for me to take out my headphones, and when I do, he begins to ask what my name was and if I knew where Water Creek was. Now, I lived in my city my whole life, and not once have I ever heard of a place called Water Creek. I just assumed it was some neighborhood and apologized and told him I didn't know where it was and that my name was Sarah. There was a long pause after I told him this, until he asked for directions to another area I didn't know the name of. Wanting to just get home and not wanting to talk to him anymore, I lie and tell him to go straight and make 2 lefts until he gets onto the highway. He stops for a moment in confusion and asks me if I could get into the car to direct him and that he'd pay for an Uber so I could get back. I politely decline and tell him I had a curfew and had to get home. However, he persisted and asked again if I could please get into the car with him. I tell him no once again and walk a bit faster so he could hopefully get the hint. Thankfully he does, where he then says something along the lines of, "You have a nice night, Sarah." I managed to make it home safely, but not without my mom scolding me about how I was out so late and why I didn't call her. My mom is not a night owl by any means and always went to bed early, hence why I didn't call her to pick me up. I give her the usual "I'm sorry" statement and head up to my room to get some sleep. Now, here's where things start to get really weird. I was asleep for a good few hours when I suddenly awoke to a weird noise from outside. I take a look at my phone and it's about 3:30 a.m. I just sighed to myself, wondering what it was that was keeping me awake. Anyways, there I am, looking out my window and see the all too familiar Honda Accord with someone standing below my window. "Hey, Sarah, you up there? Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." I scream at the top of my lungs, causing my mom to barge into my room in a panic. I'd like to note that my mom is ex-military and doesn't take crap from anyone, so when she came into my room, she was alert. I find the words to tell her that there was a man on our property who had been following me. My mom then had this visibly upset face and opened my window where she began to scream at the man, telling him to back off or that she would end him. My mom is very tough and demanding, so when I saw that he wasn't going away, I got chills. Why my dad isn't home is another story that was way too long worth explaining. The man just stood there on my lawn, staring up at the window as if he were waiting for one of us to come down. I then see my mom run over to her room, only for her to come back out. In her hand, a pistol. She cocks back the gun and points it out the window, aiming it directly at the man. My mom begins to count to 3, and that's when the man finally gets in his car and drives off. To be honest, he probably thought my mom was bluffing when she said she'd end him, which is why he didn't leave then. I hug my mom, and we call the police who had patrolled the area looking for the guy. Unfortunately, they didn't have any luck doing so. I'm not sure what his motive was, and I don't really want to know. However, I had found out just what it was not too long after. It wasn't until a few days later where we had gotten the news that a girl just a little older than me had went missing in the area. She was found dead in a field nearly 5 miles away from where she was last seen. The local media picked up on it, and when we saw the person responsible, I nearly threw up. Yeah, you guessed it. It was the same person who tried to lure me into their car. The same person who was at my house that night. Thankfully, he was arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Some say he had a bail of $100,000 to his name that his family ended up paying, but that's not been confirmed nor denied. I sincerely hope he's still locked up in prison, and if he isn't, I hope he's suffering somehow. This world is truly broken. This story is told in the perspective of a female. This all took place when I was around 16 or 17. I lived in one of the more poor neighborhoods of Los Angeles and have always been taught the dangers of adults with bad intentions. I was obviously aware of this, but to be honest, I didn't pay much attention as I had that mindset that it would never happen to me. I know, big mistake. For context, it was the summer of 2016 and I had just gotten home from school when I got a text from my best friend inviting me to a party. I had a lot of homework to do, but seeing as it was a Friday night with the weekend upon us, I told her I was down. My mom, who was near and dear to me, had dropped me off that night, telling me to have fun but to always be aware and not to go home with anyone. I didn't think much of her reminder as usual. I met up with my friend, who I'll refer to as Abigail, who introduced me to some of her friends as well. Fast forward a few hours later, we're all partying and overall just having a good time when I start to remember just how tired I was. I obviously didn't want to sleep at the party, so I tell Abigail that I'm gonna head home and to get some sleep. Being the good friend she was, she offered to drive me home, which I declined for some reason, telling her I'd be fine. In hindsight, this is the one thing I shouldn't have done. I thank her for inviting me and begin my walk home with my hoodie over my head, just reflecting on life. Whenever I have moments by myself or alone, I always found myself at peace for some reason. It was around 2 a.m. and there were almost no cars on the streets, which was rare considering that this was a huge residential area. I'm about halfway home when I see a bus stop up ahead. Sitting on the bench of this bus stop was a middle-aged woman wearing a nightgown holding a baby that had been crying. The baby is covered in a blanket, so while I did notice it, I didn't actually see it. At one point, the woman sees me and practically begs for me to give her money to feed her baby. Being a broke high school student with no job, I apologized and told her I didn't have any. This didn't seem to faze her as she disregarded what I had said, still asking for money. Saying things as to how her baby was sick, that it needed food, etc. I apologize once again and tell her no, and as I'm trying to get away, I notice something off. The way the baby was crying sounded weird. I couldn't put my finger on it, but after a few seconds, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. The crying is on a loop. It's the same sobbing, screaming, then wailing circling back. It didn't take me long to figure out that it was a speaker and that there was probably no baby. The woman seemed to have caught on to my suspicions as she's now staring at me with this blank face, I told the woman that I actually forgot my wallet at my house and told her I'd go get it and that I'd be back. With that, I ran back to the party so fast, praying to God nobody followed me. I ended up telling Abigail about it and stayed at the party until my mom came for me. She gave me some criticism for my negligence, but was thankful I was safe. The authorities were called, but I don't remember if they found the woman or not. Till this day, I still don't know what their intentions were. Chances are they weren't good. It was probably the scariest moment of my life, and it's also the reason why I never walk home alone at night. This took place in 2017 when I was a junior in college. For context, I live in somewhat of a small town in East Massachusetts, which happens to be quite a ways away from my campus. This commonly resulted in me having to rely on taking the train to get to and from school for classes. When my parents were home, I'd normally just get a ride from them, but when they weren't home, I'd have to take the train. Owning a car was expensive, and taking an Uber was a hassle. I'd mostly take the train to and from campus where I would go during the day and get home by night. As a child, I've always had somewhat of an innate fear of the night. Not so much the night itself, but what lies in the night. I've never had anything to base this fear on until a night I had gotten off at the train station and saw a woman sitting by herself on a bench. This was weird as it was closing in on 1 a.m. on a school night, which meant that no other trains would be operating until the next day. For whatever reason, I look over to her and we briefly make eye contact. But from there, it was too late. From my peripheral vision, I can see the woman begin to get up and walk over to me in a hurry. Acting like I didn't notice or care, I ordered an Uber to get home when she comes up to me and stands about 3 feet away from me. I give her a smile and she's looking at me with this blank expression, as if she were doing something mundane, like taking out the trash or mowing the lawn. In the most monotone voice I've ever heard, she says, "Hi, my car is broken. Can you help me fix it?" First of all, there's no cars in the nearby parking lot, and second, if she did have a car, why was she waiting at a train station? I thought of it as a little weird, but I didn't feel threatened or afraid. I apologized and told her that I couldn't as I had a curfew and had to get home. However, she disregarded what I had said and kept on insisting for me to help her. Being a guy who majored in engineering, I would have helped, but seeing as there was no car in sight, I couldn't do anything. I then asked her about this, expecting her to come up with some excuse. But instead of responding to me with a reason, she says something that still haunts me till this day. "Come on now, Brandon. Don't bother me with details." After that, she then forms this unsettling smile that looked like it had belonged to a witch that chilled me to the bone and went back to where she was sitting. To put things into perspective, Brandon is my name, and I have no idea as to how she knew it. I've never seen this woman in my life, and I wasn't wearing anything that would display my name. Thankfully, my Uber had pulled in and I had gone home. Later that same week, I had woken up to 10 plus phone calls and texts from different numbers. All of them ranging from "Hi, how are you?" to "I'll find you." I knew there was a big chance that it had to do with something from the other night. Two things don't happen in a short period of time like that without them being linked somehow. I never saw that woman again, and I don't take the train at night.